Morning, everyone. This is Colby Anderson. I'm here with the Hidebound Convivium, and today I'm talking on the problem of housing and wages for the conservative community, specifically the conservative Catholic community. This is a problem that I think isn't addressed enough in conservative traditional circles, and it's a big problem because it affects how the movement can exist in the real world. We understand that housing and wages are pretty much the two limiting factors on the large families that God intended us to have. We know that in the middle of the 19th century, from census data, 6 to 9 kids was pretty common in the middle of the 19th century. And given the advances of modern medicine and this and that, that's not unrealistic for a family that is practicing conservative sexual ethics might have that number of children. So this raises a problem, right? Um, which is the affordability of housing. So, according to Zillow, the average price for a house in the United States is around $200,000. It's a bit cheaper in some areas and a bit more expensive in others, but the average is about $200,000. In San Francisco, so if you live in San Francisco, if you have, or a comparable metro like Seattle, for example, and you have one of those high powered jobs, you're looking at probably $4,600 a month in rent. And in Chicago, it's a little bit more manageable. So if you live in one of these old growth cities, Chicago, for example, you can get a three-bedroom apartment for $2,100, which is better than San Francisco, but it's not exactly cheap. And inaccessibility of housing is a serious problem for the conservative movement. In previous times, people were more comfortable with living in closer quarters. You think about immigrant communities that came over to the United States in the 19th, early 20th century, and how they kind of, they were in these tenement apartment buildings. You would have, one family in like a three-room apartment, big family, and they kind of lived, very close, shall we say. But nowadays we know that not only is it kind of unsanitary, people just don't want to live like that. People don't want to live like sardines packed on top of each other. And I don't think it's clear that people back then wanted to live that way either. It was just sort of a something they did out of necessity. So this combination of a unavailability of housing and the large conservative families that everyone's talking about having, we're gonna have 9 kids and blah 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 blah. And that's good. That's great. But where are you gonna put them? Because the one thing that kids need is space to sleep and eat and do what kids do. And this is something that the conservative movement and the Catholic Church especially has to wrestle with. Protestant denominations, obviously, they caved on the contraceptive question, so I guess this isn't a relevant discussion for them, but for the Catholic Church, this is a relevant discussion. And the solution seems to have been for the clergy to get behind natural family planning. So I'm going to read a little bit from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops site because I think this is illuminating. It says, God designed marriage as a, quote, intimate partnership of life and love. They quote Gaudium et Spes. In God's design, marriage is a unique union of one man with one woman for the whole of life, canon law. Marriage is oriented to the good of the spouse and to the creation and nurture of new human life. Not controversial. Making decisions, therefore, about when and how many children to have in marriage is a sacred responsibility that God has entrusted to the husband and wife. That's puzzling to me. Um, I I don't think that's actually the case, or at least that doesn't seem to be the case. Especially, I'm having a hard time squaring that circle in light of, things that other popes have said. I give the specific example of Pope Pius XI, who issued a papal encyclical, Casti Connubi, and a letter to Italian midwives that seemed to suggest that natural family planning, in the sense of limiting the sexual congress to the infertile period, can be done with, what some conservative Catholics call the quote unquote contraceptive mindset, and that this is also disordered. And I think that makes a little bit more sense, if I'm honest. So, why am I bringing this all up? I feel like, in a sense, the clergy has kind of betrayed the laity here a little bit, because what they've basically said is, oh, you don't need to have large families anymore because the economic conditions are not favorable to it, and blah, blah, blah. The thing that you would hope they would have done would be to come out and say these economic conditions are unfavorable to the traditional family, so we need to change them, and agitate for different economic conditions, and that's not happening apparently. Apparently they have just decided we're going to do contraceptive things, basically, under the guise of natural family planning, and we're going to say that it's people's own responsibility to know when God is calling them to have another child, and that's convenient, isn't it? So that kind of illuminates what some Catholics mean when they say that natural family planning can be used contraceptively. Ultimately, the question is hinging on what is considered a severe enough financial or medical burden to refrain from having children. If you read the letter to Italian midwives, the Pope seems to suggest that the reasons for limiting the sexual congress only to the infertile periods have to be pretty dire. It doesn't seem like he's saying, well, if you don't have enough room in your apartment, you can just limit the sexual congress to those infertile periods. It doesn't seem like he's saying that. Kind of seems like he's saying, if you have another kid, you need to get a bigger apartment. Or at least that's what I would imagine him to say. It's not something that's explicitly laid out in the letter. Anyway, um, regardless of what the real answer is on that question, it seems clear that purposefully limiting that sexual congress only to the infertile periods when there is no serious obstacle to childbearing, either medical or economic, is suspect. It would seem here that rather than upholding a more traditional form of the family, the clergy have opted to acquiesce to the demands of the wider culture. Basically, all I'm saying. The economic forces on the family, not just the availability of birth control, have made a large family more difficult, certainly impossible in some areas of the country. This is something that I think G.K. Chesterton touched on when he talked about how employers kind of seized on birth control so they wouldn't have to pay their workers enough to support a family. Because we're not talking about a living wage. A living wage is a bit lower than a family wage. So, yeah. This is part of the reason why Catholics should be against the current economic order. But also make no mistake that a socialist order would be equally disastrous. So, don't let that pendulum swing the other way, because, under our current corporatist capitalist framework, maybe wages aren't what they need to be, maybe housing isn't as available for various economic reasons. But if we go to a socialist framework, then we're looking at things like, one child, two child policies, forced abortions, things that also are not are not good for the traditional family. So the problem is twofold, really. It's the affordable family housing and the availability of jobs that will pay a family wage. So it's often the case that access to a job that pays a family wage comes with higher housing prices in the area, which makes housing a large family impractical. And this is the dilemma facing conservatism and Catholics especially. The material means for living out a conservative life in the culture just don't seem to be there. At least, I haven't seen people really discuss this a lot. The actual boots on the grounds, I guess. What are we going to do about the fact that it doesn't seem practical to raise 9 children anymore? And there are a couple of potential solutions, but almost all of them are not going to work. Wages either need to go up dramatically or the cost of housing needs to go down, or preferably both. Trends are not looking promising for the former, and they're definitely not promising for the latter. Housing is Cost of housing is not going down, and wages are. I think at this point they're growing faster than inflation, but I don't know. There is, a process of decommodification of housing. It's an idea that's been tossed around by Christian social democrats, but given that a large portion of the stock market, including people's retirement assets, rely on real estate speculation, this seems like the least likely thing that could possibly be passed. And even if it did pass, there's no telling what unintended consequences it might have. It seems that it's not so much the housing supply is artificially low, but that the housing supply in areas where jobs pay sustainable wages is particularly low. And another thing is that new development also seems to prioritize small apartments rather than family homes because the up and coming careers, right, like, software engineer or whatever, Silicon Valley thing that you're doing, it's mostly going to be done by young single people. So, not people with large families. So, most of the growth in housing and new developments is going to be small apartments. Rural areas, places like where I live, are a bit more sustainable. Wages are low, but so is the cost of living. I think the best solution seems to be buying a reasonably sized house and adding on to it as necessary, or buying land and building a house, which, depending on how you go about that, could even be cheaper. And this is a precarious solution, though, because given the volatility of the labor market, people sometimes need to move for work. And if you sink 10 or 15 years into a house, you build all these additions onto it, and then your job is gone and you have to move like that. That seems like a waste of time, doesn't it? But if a family does get established in an area, then you have more options. Then you have more things to think about. If you do get established in an area, like you have a family that has long-standing ties, especially in a small town, the principle of primogeniture is extremely important. You want to keep a family's assets whole, and that'll ensure that they survive for multiple generations rather than being broken up and increasingly diffused. So, if you have paid for land, if you have a house that's paid for, it'll afford a family a secure, base of operations, if you will. When some members of the extended family are on hard times, they can come stay at the sort of ancestral home of the family. I suppose it's good to have that sort of thing to fall back on, really. Ultimately, the best piece of advice that I can give to conservative Catholics is to be comfortable with less. If you follow a traditional plan for married relations, you'll have less nice things than your neighbors, more than likely. You'll have older cars, house is not going to be as nice, your finances will be tighter, you won't go on extravagant vacations, and ultimately, this is just because the path of authentic marriage requires extreme sacrifice. Nothing in the Christian life is easy, and the dilemma that's facing traditional family relations is just another reflection of that. But anyway, this is Colby Anderson with the Hidebound Convivium, signing off.